Welcome to Transform Now, the podcast brought to you by robotic process automation pioneer SS&C Blue Prism. Digital transformation has the potential to reshape the way companies service their customers, engage their employees, and manage their operations. Whether you're looking to develop strategies, tactics, or best practices to positively impact the future of work, or you're curious to see how other companies have successfully navigated their digital transformation programs, then this podcast is for you. We're here to help you transform now.
Hello, everyone. I'm Michael Marchuk. Welcome to the Transform Now podcast. Our guest in this episode is a two-timer. It's Tonille Miller. She's the founder of EXT, Experience and Transformation. She is the recent author as well for a book that we're going to be talking about today called The Flourishing Effect. And she's getting a whole lot of praise from her industry peers on this. So I'm really excited to go through this with her and talk a little more about how transformation works and the other parts of it that are really important to our expertise and our experience in this. So as part of this, Tonille, not everyone has heard your first podcast with us. So I'd like you to introduce yourself again and give us your background, because I think it makes a difference when you start talking about this book.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you, Michael, for having me. I've been looking forward to this since we connected. So I think the way that I describe my career is I've spent it mainly as a management consultant, an IO psychologist, and an executive coach. And what I've done in those roles is really advised and partnered with leaders and HR executives across organizations to drive what I would call the optimal performance of their people and their organizations.
Gotcha. So your experience within your client base has led you to start formulating some other broader ideas that, as you talk with your clients, you needed to, show how your expertise is working within their environment. But the book that you wrote here, I think is amazing. I thought it's a fantastic way of exposing folks who may not have access to your expertise to understand how this really impacts the way that the companies grow or are growing. When you talk about this, the book's called The Flourishing Effect, and it's made some waves by exploring some of the traditional business values that we've caused organizations to stumble and their employees to check out. So what is the flourishing effect, and what have you discovered as you've been working with these companies?
Yeah. In my work over the years, which has been between 15 and 20 years at this point in time, I've really discovered what I would say are blind spots and ways that the organization or leaders inadvertently create the exact experiences that I would say bump up against human nature instead of leveraging it and working with it. And then as a result, they end up failing to engage and unlock their talent in the organizational performance. So I started seeing that over. And I would say the flourishing effect, the way I describe it is it's what happens when we actually remove sources of unnecessary friction and we remove the ways that the organization frustrates people's human needs. And on top of that, we actually start trying to provide experiences that meet people's human needs for meaning, purpose, well-being, connection, belonging, growth, contribution, all those things that we've heard about when you think about Maslow's hierarchy or some of the other theories. Those human needs are the ones that we're talking about. And by doing this, it actually produces optimal, again, well-being, engagement, and high performance from their people. And then as a result, the organization.
So the Maslow's hierarchy of needs, going back to some of our Psych 101 kind of stuff, the pieces of that aren't necessarily always reflected in the way that management deals with working in their business. So how have you seen that connection between the needs that people have versus the needs that the business have? And are there any conflicts in that?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think that unfortunately, I would say there appear to be conflicts. It's often positioned as, it's about the business or the people. I hear a lot of, but I honestly see it as both and I actually see it as a very causal relationship. So if we actually focus on meeting these needs and not frustrating them, I see that actually makes the business flourish as a result. So instead of saying it's one or the other, it's actually both, and one causes the other and vice versa. So when we're frustrating them. So think about, for example, if you want to think about like an employee experience and a customer experience, I think we've seen a lot of data from Tiffany Bova from Salesforce and others of like a direct correlation between creating a great employee experience and then the customer experience those employees deliver. And I think she found the number to be like, it increases revenue twice as much or something. It was a pretty big, significant number. And so that's something to look at. And so the thing is, like, when you think about some of these sources of friction and frustrating the human needs, I bucket them into three areas. So one, I consider the organization provides a distorted reality. So this is things like employees having to step back in time when they go to work to use old clunky technology, or operating from that kind of outdated social contract where back in the day we were promised bonuses and pensions and we devoted our whole career to one company for our whole life, mainly. We're still operating from that kind of that promised relationship, which neither side knows is neither side believes is actually going to play out in today's world. So there's like that piece. There's workplaces that, again, contradicts human nature that becomes a problem. So in this regard, it would be things like treating people like value to be extracted. So to your point, the managers or leaders of the organization treating people very transactional because they're focused on the business, that frustrates the human need. Sometimes oftentimes actually, I think the work is not that engaging itself because it's actually been stripped of the autonomy, creativity, and ownership in return for standardization and consistency. So that's the way we're focusing on what the work does for the business. We're not focusing on how that impacts the person. Treating adults like children, demanding them come to the office, like all those kinds of things are just a couple examples. I'll pause, but those are some of the ways that I see this playing out.
So you just mentioned something that I wanted to talk specifically about. And so this return to the office kind of discussion, when we talk about folks needing the connection and needing stuff, how does that need to build relationships at work impacted by the remote work and then the demands for organizations to return to the office? Because you can almost argue that we want you to come back in the office because there are other relationships that you can further grow while you're here versus I could stay home and have the relationships with my family members, which I've now grown to really appreciate now that we've had this whole COVID experience allowing me to do that more frequently. So how are those things complementary or in conflict with one another?
Yeah, it's a $1 million question right now because I do see a lot of leaders saying,
I'm all about asking $1 million questions. I mean, just tell you.
Maybe great. I think there's a few things that come to mind. And I haven't flip-flopped on this, but I've definitely come a little bit more to the other side of the fence because again, I've successfully done myself and with clients remote and hybrid work for a decade. So in the beginning of this whole situation, I was, guys, you're not understanding it. You can still do everything, culture, relationships, all that, even hybrid, even remote, and you certainly can. I think what I've learned though, is that because nobody's been given a guidebook or here's how we do it, I think that's where it has been done poorly in some situations. So to your point, people do not know how to do it unless they're together. And so what I would say is, I think we need to first discern between being in person physically and the connection/belonging relationships piece, because it's like the difference between being alone and being lonely. So you could be in a room full of people and feel super lonely if you don't connect with them, if you don't feel like you belong, you're not accepted, that sort of thing. Or you could be on your own at home, working from home, or maybe living, I don't know, somewhere out in the middle of nowhere. But if you're very connected in your community and you belong, you're not going to feel lonely. I think we need to first make that discernment there. The other thing I want to throw out here, this is actually cutting edge data. Annie Dean and the team in Atlassian, I don't know if you've spent a lot of time in her work, but essentially they conducted a ton of research and experiments here during the pandemic. And they just came out with this new playbook on their website. It's free. It's called 100 Days of Remote, I think. And in that, they actually dig into this exact question. What they found running all kinds of these experiments, they highlight the fact that the data shows zero correlation between being in the office and having a team feel connected. But what they did find is that when you intentionally bring teams together about 3 times a year for just a couple days or whatever, to intentionally build that connection. So it's not just we're getting together to work in a conference room, but we're actually focused the whole agenda basically on like just different activities that we're connecting and building relationships. They found that actually led to an average of, I think, 27% of an increase in feelings of connection. And they found that boost lasts like 4 to 5 months. And on top of that, they found that there's no correlation between the radically going to the office, random days, whatever, and actually having connection on a team. I think that data is pretty compelling. And, we have the anecdotal part, we have the data part. And so I guess what I would say is, regardless of where people are located, I think leaders who intentionally create those opportunities for shared experiences, shared challenges, shared purposes, that kind of thing. And again, there's no cost anything necessarily. It's just how you position things in the conversation and being deliberate. I think that's actually a really great way to ignite this really powerful sense of connection.
That makes a lot of sense. I mean, I suppose when you look at the personalities that people have, some will be more drawn towards being a part of an office naturally because that's what they prefer, versus others who prefer to be in a remote because they are able to get more work done or whatever their rationale is behind it. So I imagine going into that could be a case-by-case basis based on the people that you have on your teams.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's the other part too of why this whole RTO demand thing is not working. There's a lot of reasons why it doesn't work, but that hits on, I think, one of the biggest ones is that we're all adults. We all know how we can be most effective and work best. So to your point, maybe I do work best in office. Awesome. I should have the choice to do that. Maybe you don't, and you should also have the choice to be wherever you are most effective. If you need to go in for connection or you need to go out for whatever, great. But if you feel like you actually are more effective and happier as an employee working remotely, that should be the option versus demanding a big blanket statement that everybody comes in 4 days a week or something.
Yeah, that makes sense. That makes sense. Companies have people who are experienced in all this stuff, and certainly technology had made it or enabled us to be able to be more remote based on how our systems and such are working together. Technology also changing the way that we work. And so as we look at executives who are promoting these capabilities for their people to leverage the technology. So think about ChatGPT or some of these AI models and whatnot. How can executives promote the capabilities in their people to be able to leverage these new technologies to allow the company to flourish, but also to have the people themselves understand how their roles might be changing?
Yeah. And again, another $1 million question. You're asking all the good ones today. I think this is becoming increasingly important as these technologies become more prevalent and then just exceedingly fast. They're coming at us as well. So I think it's becoming more and more important because of this to focus on nurturing the most humane aspects of our people, right? Because again, pretty soon, more and more, we're going to find that the technology is taking on all of those kind of automatable tasks and more mundane stuff. So then guess what? What's left? The most humane parts of our people. And I think up until now, basically since the Industrial Revolution, many organizations have really focused more and more on treating people transactionally, as we talked about a little bit ago, like robots. But now that the robots are taking over, we need to really nurture our humans so that they can actually deliver on those really humane aspects that machines can't do. And so they can't do that though when we're frustrating their human needs and when we're putting all sorts of friction in their path. That really makes it difficult for the humans to actually do the most humane stuff they need to do. So what I tend to recommend is, again, removing as many of these frictions as possible and then really start meeting those human needs. And that's why I brought this to bear in this book at this time as well, because of this exact fact. And so with that, it's like one thing you could do is you can look at, the entire journey of the employee, right? The whole journey, the experience, and just determine what are their pain points? What are the sources of friction? You can do that through surveys, listening strategies, journey mapping, however you want to do it. And then really co-creating with them or with a cross-functional team to really unearth what those are and remove those. And then I think you can also start to meet some of the people's human needs, holistic well-being, for example, by make sure that you're paying about a living wage, making sure you're educating people on these topics. Things like farmers markets on site, if you have people on site, that kind of, just like all those little things that we hear about wellness being, and like a culture that allows people to take walking phone calls, right? And allows people to unplug and those kinds of things for well-being, focusing on connection and belonging. Again, some of the stuff we mentioned earlier is really helpful in that regard, as well as just creating things like bonding events and all hands and offsites and things like that, I think can be really powerful. Let's see what else. When you think about nurturing our humans, I think the growth and actualizing potential is going to be really important here as well, because one of our most essential human needs is to feel like we're actually fulfilling our potential and we're growing. And of course, Gen Z, millennials specifically, this is really important for them. So I think organizations are, winning when they're really focusing on that. And then the autonomy and agency piece that we talked about earlier, providing as much of that as possible. And I think the last thing I mentioned here would be with meaning and purpose, right? There's a lot of no-cost ways to do that. It's all about how managers position the work, right? Building interdependence amongst the team members, showing them how their inputs and outputs impact each other, connecting dots, showing people how any other random menial tasks are actually connected to the client and the customer and the world, perhaps. So I think those are just some ways that people can get started on doing that.
That makes sense. So you brought up something that I wanted to loop back to. You're talking about the actualization and the things that Gen Zs and millennials have needed. I want to ask, is it because it's only millennials and Gen Zs that have needed it, or is it because they've been more vocal about it?
Yeah, this is what I see. I think a lot of folks argue that it's a generational thing. I don't think it is. I think it's an actual human thing. It's all generations, but I think to your point, very much well taken, is that they've just been more vocal. And I think they've been raised in an era where they've had more of a voice box. Not only are they influencers with their peers on social media and the way that they're doing these things and having their own side hustles and all that and influencers, but also just generationally, I think for the most part, millennial parents and Gen Z parents actually raise their kids much more as adults in the sense of consulting them. Because again, maybe the parents didn't understand the new technologies. So they're like, hey, can you help me figure out my phone? Hey, can you help me figure out this? And that kind of just became more of a consultative relationship. So now when they go to the workplace, these folks are like used to that. And so they're used to asking for what they want. And they are. I think it's a great thing, actually.
I agree. I agree. These technologies, you mentioned the robots are helping to support and allowing us to look at employees as people more humanely. How can these technologies and the changes they have there allow people to find more meaning in their work? Is it possible?
Yeah. And this is something that I think we need to talk more about. I think a lot of folks get scared, and a lot of my work is yours as well, is involved in that intersection of the changing in technology in the organization, and people are scared, they're resisting, they're nervous. So I think we need to bring this out more often. And I think the more that AI and other technologies can take on those mundane, automatable tasks that people, they want to do anyways, it's a good thing. We need to focus on that.
Right.
And actually focusing on it frees the people up to do the work they should have always been doing, which again is harnessing the most humane, empathic, and creative aspects of the human. And so a couple of things come to mind when I think about this. So for example, as an individual contributor's routine tasks are like seamlessly handled by machines and software, the human workers can actually start engaging in that higher order thinking, problem solving, and innovation. And I think that this shift not only enhances the overall job satisfaction, but it also empowers people to contribute more in more meaningful ways to their organization, right? And that may be with their colleagues, maybe more from a strategic point of view. If we're transparent with them, that they understand the business strategy, they can do more of those types of things instead of these finite tasks. They don't see how they fit together. And in this environment, I think people can switch from their, what I would say is their left brain, linear thinking, analytical mind, and kind of that transactional way of operating, which we all do. I know it. I do too. We can switch from that because if the robots and the machines are taking on that type of work, we can switch from that and we can start exploring what I think is really exciting, which would be that right brain, that more intuitive, the way that we perceive or process information in that more intuitive way, as well as the more, the higher, more emotionally intelligent ways of operating toward each other. So I think that's really exciting. And when you think of like managers too, like their job today is very different, right? So it's not managing tasks and telling people what to do anymore. It's actually leveraging AI and automation tools to do that managing part of their manager role. And then the manager's role is actually now to connect with their people on a human level, right? Remove the obstacles, treat them like human, having that one-on-one connection. Again, that goes back to your point about building connection. And that actually creates a lot of meaning for their people when they're doing that. And they're focusing on connecting the dots for what their people are doing and how it impacts their people. And then when you go up even higher, when you think about leaders in general, their role really now in this world is to be storytelling, right? About how this person over here impacted the customer, storytelling about how that person's role, what they were doing, contributed to the organizational purpose or the social impact. So I think there's a lot of really exciting ways that people at all levels can get involved here as more AI and technology takes over.
I think you bring up some good points, and that's related to the role changes that we're seeing. It's not just the individual contributors who are being impacted by the technology changes. Yes, transactional component of their particular role may have transitioned into a robot or an automation or AI component. But the reality is that the other parts of the organization have to also adapt to the role changes, not just from an individual contributor perspective, but as an overall organization. So if I'm looking at building out these changes within my organization to adopt more automation or AI, because that's just happening, how do we see these established organizations that are adopting these new technologies, the role changes, and they're running very lean because we've already leaned out the whole organization, right? What can these management teams do in their new roles to help people lean into the change instead of being run over by it?
Yes, all $1 million questions today. Yes, I have a whole chapter on this in my book. It's the last chapter because I figure like everything else I talk about doesn't matter if you can't lead change and really make change happen and make these things happen. If you can't do it, then it doesn't matter. I think that these ideas will really benefit any leader trying to do more with less as well, just because almost all of the strategies and tools that we're going to talk about are low, no cost, which is great for everyone, I think. And so the way I think about it is it's more about how we work and how we operate, not what we're buying, not what we're implementing. It's about how we're doing it. It's about being deliberate and practicing it daily. What I would say is in today's dynamic landscape where people are really, as you mentioned, we're stretched thin, we're super lean, change is coming at unprecedented rates. What we've learned is that the traditional top-down approaches no longer work. I think back in the day, the Jack Welch days, like I'm sure that worked fine then. It does not work now. It's not going to work tomorrow. So we need to have some other tools in our toolbox here. And I think the key to success really lies in putting your workforce at the center of your change efforts. So this involves really harnessing the power, again, of human nature, of the humans, leveraging behavioral economics, for example, and really embracing the innovative design thinking methods for the most part. That's what I do in a lot of my work. And so a couple things come to mind. So I would say number one, we need to think about how we frame it, right? So let's frame the changes and the things we're trying to drive in terms of commonalities, such as shared values or what's important to employees, framing things in terms of that. So for example, we're going to help you be more valuable inside and outside the organization by upskilling you when we bring in robots. It's not just, oh, get scared, we have robots coming in. Like, hey, what's in it for the employees? And make sure we're leading with that, framing it in terms of, we all know this technology is coming. We're actually getting ahead of it. Some of the firms I've worked for have done this really well. And we're going to free you up for that more strategic work. So really framing it in that way. And again, senior leaders really being aligned to it, really make sure obviously they're aware, they're bought in, they're committed, but they're also very much visibly role modeling the changes and they're telling stories about it. They're sharing the impacts with people, rewarding people as well for doing the right things that we're looking for. And then I think with that too, when you think about managers, we really have to arm them and prepare them to support people, right? Because they're really the linchpin, I think, in change management. So they're the closest to people. They have the most direct influence on other people. And so they should definitely be brought in, I would say, as early as possible when you're thinking about implementing any kinds of changes and get them to weigh in, them to co-create with you and help do the change management with you, help design it with you. And with that, I think also just really being proactive. A lot of change people, when they do change, they don't proactively look for friction ahead of time. They always try to say, oh, let's get ahead of resistance, but they don't really proactively seek out friction and resistance. I think you should do it proactively because then you can actually build that in and address it in your planning in the beginning instead of wondering why people didn't adopt later. So you could do that. I think tapping into influencers is actually really helpful and getting them to co-create with you as well. And then I think the last piece I would talk about here is just activating the change from within by starting, I guess what I would say is like a movement that resonates with employees. So it's partially a branding campaign, but it's also very real in the sense of it's getting people involved on a grassroots level and getting that, tapping in at like peer-to-peer motivation and inspiration as well, versus just the CEO sending an email that's been effective today. So I think really doing the movement part. And then again, wherever you can, I always try to bring in behavioral economics. So for example, that might mean if you had a change coming and you really wanted people to opt in to benefit or to choose their benefits or do something, whatever you want them to do, the point is you want to make it as easy as possible for them to do it. And so you would, with them, try to make it as out as possible. So if you, for example, like I said, if you want people to sign up for their benefits, make it like an automatic sign up where they have to actually opt out if they don't want. So just little things like that, I think, can drive change in really interesting ways.
There's a couple of things you mentioned that I thought were very interesting. One was about the culture, the top-down culture piece versus the transition to helping to tell stories about the benefits of it. But the also one was on friction. So you mentioned seeking out friction. I know most change people will look at this and you're trying to do transformation in your organization. You're looking at the happy path. How best can we automate this, or how best can we transition these roles to be doing the outcome that we want with the most optimistic kind of viewpoint towards it. But to your point, I think looping in the detractors, there's always going to be cheerleaders, but looping in the detractors will help you actually not only get ahead of it, but also maybe transition some of the things. They're detractors for a reason, right? There's something specific that they are having in mind that I don't like this because. And if you can start addressing those becauses, they may be valid becauses. They may be real reasons why they don't want to make these transitions besides I must stick in the mud. So going after that could actually be more beneficial to the program overall because you're actually looking for folks who are going to have those valid experiential reasons why they wouldn't want to make a transition. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. To your point, it's going to make the change or whatever you're implementing better because it's going to address those things, hopefully, once you learn them, but also just having those detractors, just them being heard psychologically will make them more supportive. And if you bring them in, they'll start co-creating with you, which is actually going to buy them in subconsciously. So it's a lot of really great benefits.
That's really good. And it also changes the culture then too, because you end up having your detractors now become more supportive, which then could help them influence, your influencers influence others to change the culture, even if it's slowly, but you're changing the culture, which will then support the overall organizational well-being then.
Yep, absolutely.
So move from organizational well-being to human well-being. I heard you have a new book coming out, at least it's brewing in your head. What can we look forward to?
Yeah, I've heard some great feedback so far. I'm very excited about that. And I think in this book, it really does shed light on, like I mentioned, the blind spots that I kept seeing. And it just highlights that relationship that we talked about between employee thriving and the business success. And it shows readers and leaders how to transform their organization into these thriving ecosystems, right? Where again, it's the win-win both. And the cool thing about the book, again, I'm very much like a data geek. So I pull in lots of research and case studies that's there, which is great. And I also make it very practical, simple tools and strategies people can get started with tomorrow.
And what's next then for you?
After that, I'm working on a second book, and this is very different in many ways as you and I were chatting about offline, but this is much more because this first book is very much about from the organizational perspective, right? It's basically like, what can the needle movers in an organization, the leaders, the HR executives, managers, what can they do? And some of the stuff is what individual people can do, but most of it's like more about that systemic view of how do we make this better. But the second book is very much more about individuals and how they can proactively flourish and thrive in their own life. And that includes in work, but it's not just focused on.
That's good. We'll look forward to talking with you about that when that comes out as well. So I want to make sure that everybody knows I'm going to leave you the show notes. We'll have a link to Tonille's book. And Tonille, thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate the conversation and appreciate your insights into these changing times that we have, both organizationally, but also personally within our own jobs.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Thanks for tuning in to Transform Now. For more insightful discussions on digital transformation and more, check out our podcast channel where you'll find all of our previous episodes. And to make sure you never miss an episode, subscribe to the show on your favorite podcast player. And if you like what you've heard, please leave us a review. For more information about digital transformation and the future of work, check out blueprism.com to learn how SS&C Blue Prism's digital workforce is enabling enterprise transformation now.